All right, guys, we want to welcome back to the Everything College Football Podcast. Today, me and Nick here, we're doing our complete 2024 Big Ten preview and prediction. Each team we've already discussed in length, so we're just going to touch briefly on them at the end of the show, starting with our awards, and then there'll be timestamps below to skip around. So we're just briefly going to touch on each team, but obviously a complete detailed preview here today. And starting with these awards, Nick, obviously Ohio State, it's been a long time since they've not won Offensive Player of the Year. I think Will Howard, he's going to come in. He's going to run this offense to a T. Obviously, we have Quinshon Judkins, so he's starting to check the boxes there. Jay Higgins, I think, is going to be a tremendous player for Iowa after a monster season where he stacked this sheet as large as you really can. Matt Rule, we'll talk about Nebraska later, but I think Coach of the Year for him seems to certainly be in play. Breakout Player of the Year, Nick, obviously we went a little different routes on these ones. I decided to go with running back Jordan James from Oregon. I think this is going to be a great player this year. They might even be able to, nudge his way into the Heisman race. And then Dennis Sutton from Penn State seems like he's going to be the next elite edge rusher coming out of the Nittany Lions. What are your thoughts on the awards you went with? Obviously, I went with a running back for my breakout player. You went one with your offensive player of the year. Why do you think Judkins is going to win that award, considering he'll be sharing that backfield with Trevion Henderson?
I think Judkins will carry the load here for Ohio State. He was brought in to be the number one back. Yes, Trevion Henderson obviously is a really talented back and will certainly help balance some of that load, but I think Judkins will have a really incredible breakout season and absolute dominate on the ground for Ohio State. I think this is a really good add out of the transfer portal, and this is a guy that has been really solid in his time at Ole Miss, and I really think that's going to continue at this point in time. His 2022, his freshman season, he had 1,500 yards rushing and 16 touchdowns. Last year, a bit of a dip in production, 1,100 yards and 15 touchdowns. But I think he can easily get to that 1,500-yard mark again this year, potentially even more. And at that point in time, I think he will earn himself Offensive Player of the Year. I think he's going to be a really dynamic, exciting back for this Ohio State offense and will really be a dominant player on the ground.
And if he is, that's going to lead to absurd production from the Buckeyes offense. You're looking at newcomer of the year. Obviously we're going to talk about Nebraska later and why Dylan Raiola is going to be a star for them. Nick Marsh for me from Michigan State. I think he's going to be a big part of the Spartans offense and what's a pretty limited wide receiver room. And then our sleeper teams being Minnesota and USC, which we'll talk about extensively a little bit later. Looking at our conference all-first team. Obviously, you're seeing a lot of Ohio State here, Nick. Three of the first four names are from the Buckeyes. Donovan Edwards wasn't all that efficient last year. Sure, have a large look of the offense this season, though, and is expected to really bounce back. And should be a 1,200-yard rusher, quite frankly, for the Wolverines. I think Evan Stewart coming over for Oregon, that's big for them. And he's, obviously the top player in the portal. And then I got with Johnny Cornelius, a tackle that's really going to emerge, I think, this year. He was a highly coveted player out of Rhode Island, had a very good season. I think for the Ducks, this is an offensive line that's going to be one of the nation's best, and he's certainly going to be anchoring it, Nick. What do you make of this all-conference offense that features a lot of the same names, but a few other guys do somehow make the list?
I like this list a lot. I think there's some seriously talented players. I think Loveland's going to be a really strong player for Michigan as they transition, as will Donovan Edwards, who is arguably the number two back in the conference, just behind Judkins. I think Judkins is a little more talented. I think Ibuka and Stewart are two incredible wide receivers that really are going to lead their way for their respective team. Will Howard stepping at quarterback could really change this Ohio State team overnight and make them into a national title favorite with the way that he throws the ball, the way he looks composed in the pocket, and his overall talent. Cornelius is a fantastic offensive line piece that I was really impressed with at his first season at Oregon. When he came out of Rhode Island, entered the portal before last season, he was wanted by everyone in the country. Basically, every team in the country was calling his name. He settled on Oregon and really developed and continues to grow as a player. We saw his jump from the FCS level to the FBS level continuously improve, and I think he's only going to get better as time goes on. I think Donovan Jackson's another really solid offensive line piece on this first team all-conference offense, a very deep, very strong unit that we put together here.
And John Monheim from USC, a guy who's been incredibly versatile for the Trojans, arriving from the Pac-12. He's going to get the start at center this year. It's expected he's going to thrive in that role there. Look at the all-conference defense. Again, a lot of the same names, including two defensive tackles from Michigan. They also have Will Johnson as well. And even though they lose a lot on that defense, Nick, the guys that do return are all going to go first round in next year's draft, so it's certainly going to be hard to not see them get the nod. Davison Igbeson from Ohio State. I think he's going to have a big year this season. I think he's going to end up being better than Denzel Burke. He's going to be in the award, the conversation to win the Thorpe Award. Dylan Thynum from Purdue. A three-star recruit, Nick, that was completely missed by everyone in the country when we talked about the Boilermakers. This kid is absurd. The way he flies through the ball, the way, he produces and plucks it out of the air as well. Caleb Downs, of course, transferring in from Alabama. But Abdul Carter is going to be the highlighted player here, Nick, a guy who's going to transition from the inside linebacking position down to the edge, an incredibly explosive player who I think is going to thrive, and you think so too, as he's your defensive player of the year in the conference. Obviously, Dennis Sutton and Carter would be tremendous as an edge rushing duo this season. It figures to be the best in the country.
I picked Carter for a reason to be my defensive player of the year for this conference, because I think he is going to have that incredible season transitioning to a bigger role. He had 48 total tackles last year, 5.5 tackles for loss, 4.5 sacks, and 5 pass breakups. They're going to move him a little bit and give him more opportunity to get after the quarterback, more pass rushing opportunity. I think he can easily get double-digit sacks and tackles for loss this year. I think that's a very easy expectation for him coming off the edge. He's a very talented player, really nice speed, good footwork. I like him to be my defensive player of the year. Some other players I think are important to look at here. I think Jay Higgins, your defensive player of the year pick, is going to have an incredible season for Iowa. And then, of course, Caleb Downs transferring over from Alabama to Ohio State. One of the best players in college football on the defensive side of the ball, the top tackler for the Crimson Tide last year, over 100 tackles. He slots in perfectly in what is the nation's best secondary, in my opinion. A really good natural-born leader that should easily be on this all-conference defense list coming into the season.
I think Xander Mueller, a lot of great linebackers in the conference from Northwestern. He's just going to be a big leader for them this season. I think he's going to be a big stat sheet stuffer. So kind of a guy there that likely won't end up on the first team, but I think can certainly make a play for. Certainly wanted to show respect there. Look at our Big Ten standings predictions, Nick. Obviously, you're going to see a lot of teams on here with double-figure wins vying for this new extended playoff. Ohio State at 12-0 for us. They do play at Oregon and at Penn State. And it's going to be hard to imagine them going 2-0 across that stretch, but I think they're going to get it done. But the biggest thing of Ohio State we want to discuss today is, can this, newfound trio of, Judkins, Will Howard, and Chip Kelly lead to the nation's best offense, when last year they disappointed, only 30.5 points per game. Harrison obviously was tremendous. McCord was good, but was ran out of town at the end of the day, and the run game really struggled other than Travion Henderson really just putting them on his back. And overall, this offense, the ceiling seemed to be capped out midway through the year, Nick. Week after week, we just kept waiting for them to emerge and drive with big momentum into the Michigan game, and they just never had it. And with all that said, they still came up about 40 yards short of winning that game and potentially even the conference. But this just wasn't good last year. Ohio State significantly disappointed. Brian Hartline as OC will now share the duties with Chip Kelly. Ryan Day, obviously a big offensive mind. I mean, there's enough cooks in the kitchen here, and there's tremendous talent across the board of guys like Jeremiah Smith showing up. Egbuka is going to be on the first 10, like we alluded to. Cornell Tate is going to be tremendous. This offensive line, I thought last year was the biggest concern, and it certainly held them back on the ground. But they need to play better in all regards, and I think with the additions they have, a bell cow running back, a great offensive guru in Chip Kelly, and then a quarterback that seems to be a better fit, if he can tone down the turnovers, has the arm to really stretch the field. The nation's best offense should be with the Buckeyes in Columbus, Nick, but again, coming off those disappointments, I mean, there's a lot that's going to be said if they're not.
If it doesn't happen this year, I don't know when it's going to happen for Ohio State in terms of winning a national championship, because this offense looks primed to be the best they've had in a very long time last year. I thought their offense was solid, but they really seemed to struggle to hit that second gear. They looked slow at times. They didn't put up a lot of points against the bad teams. They didn't put up a lot of points against the Big Ten teams, either the better Big Ten teams, that is. And they ran, Kyle McCord out of town, who I didn't think was the problem. I thought it was very harsh, but they needed a scapegoat. They picked the newcomer quarterback, kicked him out of town. He finds greener grass up in upstate New York at Syracuse, and now you plug in Will Howard, who I think Will Howard's an incredible quarterback, but the turnovers is what worries me, right? That's the big question mark here. 10 interceptions last year on 357 attempts is not a fantastic mark when you look at it like that. That's a bit of a disappointing number from him. He's got to find a way to cut down that number very soon, or he's going to find himself as the next man running out of town in Columbus. They expect big things. Ryan Day, his seat's hot in my opinion, right? It's getting warm up there. He has not been able to take this team to the promised land despite plethora of talents over and over again. A defense that was the issue in the past, being incredibly strong under Jim Knowles, and now the offense is the issue, which is kind of weird to say with Ohio State. Chip Kelly plugs in, he joins Brian Hartline as the two of them are going to split play calling duties, and now you got Will Howard, and I talked about Judkins' stats at Ole Miss earlier. Ibuka is a fantastic wide receiver. They bring an incredible 5-star talent, top wide receiver in the class as a true freshman this year. Will Howard threw for 2,600 yards last year and 24 touchdowns, plus the rushing ability with the 6'5", 245 frame. If not this year, I don't know when it's going to happen for Ohio State. They got the offense to do it. They got to go put up or shut up at this point in time. They got to go win a national title this year.
Now you look at, two teams that are going to end up rematching in Indianapolis. I'm not exactly sure how the tiebreaker works one bit, but I think they win a rematch over Oregon or Penn State. Both teams I have currently slotted at 11-1. We'll start with the Ducks. This is a team that's obviously coming in with a lot of momentum after a strong season a year ago, a great roster. They're doing a great job in recruiting. Obviously, NIL is helping with that, but Cristobal had already, begun recruiting very well in the years prior to that. And the biggest question with them, Nick, is, do they have the playmaking in the secondary and the pass rush to really make a push? Because, last year they did manage 34 sacks, but 18 of them came versus the 3 worst offensive lines in America, that being Colorado, Stanford, Washington State. They really teed off on those offensive lines. And down the stretch, they were no good. Only 9 over the last 7 games of the year. Only had 3 in the 2 losses to Washington. And, of course, the secondary is nothing but transfers. And, obviously, they haven't recruited this position as heavily. Guys like Dante Manning, Jaleel Florence haven't exactly worked out. I do want to start with this pass rush, though, because Jordan Birch is a very capable player. He just didn't show it at times at all, really. Only 3 sacks and on top of 7.5 tackles for loss. So he was a good run defender, but in terms of pass rushing upside, he didn't exactly produce. But this is a position they have recruited tremendously. A 5-star Mateo Uyungale enters his sophomore season. Aiden Breland, Elijah Rushing, 2 incoming 5-stars. They did pick up Derek Harmon and Jamari Caldwell on the interior. Those guys were going to be elite run stuffers, which should free things up more for this pass rush. And then, of course, again, the secondary that's been heavily included by transfers. You have 4 of them right now slotted to start. Callum Alexander from UTSA, Kobe Savage from Kansas State at safety, Brandon Johnson, who was a great nickel from Duke, and then Jamar Muhammad, who was one of the top corners in America last year, who a lot of people wanted in the portal. Oregon ended up getting him. And these are 2 key areas for them, Nick, because the defense certainly did play very well last year, but they were not good against the run in the Pac-12 title game. Obviously, Penix had their number through the air as well. If they would have found a little bit more pass rush, they probably would have won those 2 games, but they lost by 3 points each. And then, of course, the secondary did, bring down 12 interceptions. And obviously, they lose a lot of veterans in the back end there, Nick. What do you think of this Oregon defense? They've recruited pretty well. They've brought in some good transfers. These guys aren't no slouches by any means. What do you make of this defense, and do you think they're ready to compete?
As Oregon makes the transition to the Big Ten, the defense is going to have to step up for this team to be competitive in this new conference. The defensive woes that you saw at parts last season, they're not going to work in this new conference. Dan Lanning has been hitting the recruiting trail hard on both sides of the ball. In the offensive side of the ball, he has been recruiting very well, bringing in to carry on more in the class of 2025, the top wide receiver from the state of Texas, beating out Texas just on this past week on July 4th. I think it's important to note for the positive work that the Ducks are doing, and they're doing solid work on the defensive side of the ball. 7 transfers are penciled in to start based off the latest depth chart I'm looking at, including Kobe Savage and Jabbar Muhammad, who are 2 incredible adds for the secondary. Plus, you throw in Cam Alexander, who is a really underrated player, in my opinion, that they add on the defensive side of the ball. Is Alexander plus Muhammad and Savage going to be good enough to get this defense over the top? I'm not entirely sure, but Muhammad, one of the best cornerbacks in the country, highly rated and highly sought after out of the portal. Kobe Savage, I thought, was a really solid player during his time at his previous team at Kansas State. Really solid player overall, in my opinion. And Cam Alexander from UTSA, who I thought looked really solid on the film. You can move him around, a very versatile player. They bring back Jordan Birch, who was their top tackles for loss player last year, with 7.5 tackles for loss plus 3 sacks. But those numbers are not good enough. He needs to find a way to kick into a higher gear and get to that double-digit tackles for loss and sack number. I'm not entirely sure he can, which is why I think they fall just short behind Ohio State twice this season and find themselves potentially on the outside looking in for the playoff. I would imagine they would get in at that point in time, but it might be a close call on the expanded playoff. I like this Oregon team, but I just worry about this defense. I'm not sure they have enough of a gear to get over the top at this moment in time.
I also think that the Oregon offense is tremendous with Dylan Gabriel showing up. Great running back room. Receiving group is phenomenal. The offensive line is great as well. So this defense will certainly need to play its role. And, of course, we want to offer our condolences, Nick, to the unfortunate, tragic passing of Kyrie Jackson just yesterday morning. Awful that the guy who really turned his career around with the Ducks was drafted into the NFL by the Vikings. And, unfortunately, his life was cut short, just yesterday in a car accident.
Certainly a player that I'm quite fond of, a former Alabama player. A couple friends of mine had classes with him. I spoke to them yesterday, and they were heartbroken. And I'm heartbroken as a fan of college football and a fan of football in general, a guy that really turned it around. And to be an innocent victim like he was, his only mistake was just being in the car with his friends. Is really just sad and depressing. A talented player that turned it around and was ready to get a shot in the NFL. Absolutely condolences to his family and the family of the other victims in that car crash.
Now looking at Penn State, going 11-1 right now. Obviously, they start the year at West Virginia. That could be an interesting game for them. Other than that, though, they do host Ohio State. It's an opportunity for them to really take over the conference this year. The biggest issue, though, is can this offense show up against quality opponents, and how will they be any better? Last year going into that game against the Buckeyes, I said they're not even going to score 10 points. And their fans weren't happy with me, Nick. I said, well, check back Saturday afternoon. And they ended up with 12 of a garbage time touchdown, putting them just over that number. So I was right. I said that these guys were not going to be any good against Ohio State and any other quality opponents, really. Drew Aller, of course, they gave him the keys to the offense, was very good with only 2 interceptions. This is a guy who does have great arm talent. He can really zip it into the windows. There was some nice arcing balls. He mainly showed poise throughout the year. Some of his decision-making was sporadic, though. They do have 2 nice running backs, Nicholas Singleton and Katron Allen. That's going to be one of the top duos in the country. The biggest problem why they struggled, though, is play calling obviously wasn't ideal. The receiving group is a big problem. They do add Julian Fleming from Ohio State, who, has really struggled with durability, but he does have good size and speed at 6'2", 210. I think he has nice route running and ball skills as well. Tyler Warren is a great tight end. Of course, they had Theo Johnson last year. Harrison Wallace, a guy who has pretty good potential with his speed. Hayden Saunders as well is a pretty fast guy. Amari Evans will need to step up. Other than that, though, there's just not many guys that you're looking to at this receiving core that's really going to give you much upside in terms of, how much will they progress. And, of course, I thought the offensive line last year was going to be a big issue. Their left tackle, Ulu Fashan, who's, a really good player, but in terms of run blocking, really didn't seem to really check many boxes. And that's why I figured they would struggle, is because the physicality just wasn't all there. And they've recruited this offensive line very well. It's very quietly. They've brought in a lot of high-end recruits. Probably won't make an impact this season, though, and I think that's why I picked them to struggle so many times, just because I didn't trust the interior. Hunter Norzad was a pretty solid player. Other than that, though, guys like Sal Wormley, Ola Ayana on the interior, these guys have to be better. You're certainly wondering how Drew Shelton's going to do at left tackle and Nolan Rucci at right tackle as well. The offensive unit you expect to progress, Nick, especially in Aller's second year as a starter, but it's just really hard to find it because the negatives of last year don't really seem to improve all that much.
When you mentioned to me that you were going to say on the podcast and on social media posts that you didn't think Penn State would score double-digit points against Ohio State, I figured you were on the right track, but I knew those fans would eat you alive. And, well, they certainly did, but you ended up being the one that got the last laugh and being correct. Penn State looked absolutely horrendous on offense against Ohio State last year in a game where they really just did not show up at all when it mattered most. And I think a lot of that does rely on Drew Aller, who just struggled at times. Yes, 2,600 yards and 25 touchdowns is not bad. 2 picks, it's a fantastic number, but the 60% comp rate and just looking uncomfortable, as well as the fact that limited the play calling and the creativity did hamper this offense. The running back room, I think Ketron Allen and Nicholas Singleton are an incredible 1-2 punch. I like Tyler Warren at tight end a lot, but outside of that, I worry, is Julian Fleming going to step up and be a really great star player for this team? I'm not entirely sure. I have Penn State losing week 1 at West Virginia because I think they're just going to struggle on offense and they're going to lose a close defensive battle to West Virginia, that is, on the road in a very loud, tough environment. I think this Penn State team is the same story, right? It's the same story, different year. They're going to be a good team. They're just not going to be able to get over the top and beat those top teams, plus a shock loss on the road to the Mountaineers. I think it's the same old story with James Franklin and company. They're just not able to figure it out on offense. I think the defense is fantastic, and the defense will keep them in a lot of games, but the offense, I just don't think they're going to be able to show up against quality opponents, and that's why I have them missing out on the Big Ten title game. I don't know exactly how the tiebreakers work, so they could very well find themselves in there due to their conference losses being the same as Oregon. I'm just going to take Oregon right now because I think they're the team. They'll have the better resume, whatever the metrics are going to be to decide that at the end of the season. We're not entirely sure how that's going to work. I just think Penn State, the offense, is going to let them down again this year. Another disappointing season by Penn State standard, but overall a really strong season getting to double-digit wins.
An elite defense for the Nittany Lions. I definitely think bringing Andy Kolanecki over from Kansas will lead to some better creativity, and he obviously did great things with Devin Neal at Kansas. So I think this backfield will certainly be able to showcase more of their talents. Offense right now, certainly a questionable unit to show up against those elite opponents in the conference. Obviously very top-heavy right now. And then we move to Michigan. This is a team that finally was able to capitalize on, Jim Harbaugh's abilities as a developer and a player's coach. And they won the national championship. But now you lead to, him departing, taking some of his staff with him to the Chargers. A max exodus on offense. Really, the entire offensive line's gone. Corum departs. McCarthy, his receivers as well. And I think the biggest question here is, should we worried about this offense now? Where the quarterback room doesn't seem all that great. I certainly think that they're still going to play with some good physicality as this offensive line still has guys that have been in the system for a couple of years. Sharon Moore, obviously as well, has been primed for this role. Guys like Miles Hinton, Greg Crippen seem primed to be good at their respective starting positions. But the rest of this offense just doesn't seem all that eye-popping. I like what they have in Tyler Morris and Samaj Morgan at receiver. Other than that, what are they going to get? It's not all overblown of talent by any means. nothing but power runners in the backfield other than Donovan Edwards, so skill kind of seems limited there. They seem limited in terms of upside and arm talent at quarterback, where Jack Tuttle, a guy I don't think's all that good, is in contention to start. I think Alex Orji's going to end up being the starter, and I think you're going to see a Denard Robinson type of approach this year from the Michigan offense, Nick, where they're just going to overwhelm you with physicality from their rushing attack like they always have. But now you're going to throw that wrinkle of a quarterback running the ball 20 times per game, and that just might be a recipe that opponents don't want to see, where they're just going to run it right at you. And they were so good at doing that for so many years. If you throw that wrinkle in there, Nick, it could be devastating for you. And I think that's why Michigan's still going to be good on offense, is I think that's going to be the approach this year. And if it's not, I'm really not sure what they're going to do, because I just don't know how they're going to be able to consistently throw the ball, especially downfield. I think they're certainly going to own time of possession, so I'm not all that worried about this offense. But if I'm wrong on the philosophy, then it's going to be a disaster, I think.
There are certainly question marks in Ann Arbor post-national championship for this team. A new head coach, completely new coaching staff, and a lot of transition overall. I think the defense will be phenomenal. The defense will still be one of the nation's best units, but I do worry about this offense. I don't really know who's going to start at quarterback. I picked Jack Tuttle previously in January, and I said I reassured that, doubled down on that pick just because I think he's a veteran that's been around the game for a while, not a flashy player, sort of that quarterback of the past you've seen at Michigan, a guy that's just, more of a game manager, plug him in and play. But I could also see Alex Orji getting the starting role as well, a guy that does have high upside as a runner, not really as polished as a passer. The wide receiving room, it's not strong. Michigan's really never been strong. They really struggle to seem to recruit the talent at wide receiver, so the wide receiving room is the same as it always is, but that may let them down. They don't really have those talented pass catchers to make up for the lack of play at quarterback. The running back room is strong with Donovan Edwards leading the way, but outside of him, you really wonder what Hall and Mullings are going to look like, or Dunlap on the bottom of that depth chart. You really don't know what you're going to see. Colston Loveland is a fantastic tight end who will get a lot of targets and will certainly carry some of the burden for this offense, but in general, this offense is very weak compared to where it was last year, and I don't think they'll be able to compete based off the fact that their offense will lose them games. Their defense will keep them in games, but I think the offense will let them down in key moments with mistakes, turnovers, or just lack of ability to actually execute and get the job done. I think Michigan will have a good season, but it will be disappointing compared to where they were last year.
And I have them at 8-1 in conference. I definitely, I'm pretty sure I picked Oregon to beat Michigan. I also have Texas beating Michigan as well. Those are going to be winnable games for them, of course. You look at Iowa at 10-2, a team that, really that we're going to ask ourselves, will the same old story produce different results? And we took a deep dive of this offense, Nick, and what we found out is they're just unserious about making really any substantial changes. Cade McNamara coming back at quarterback should provide some slightly better play, because I thought Deacon Hill was awful. Didn't think he had any good potential either. I think they have a nice running back duo with Sean Williams, Caleb Johnson. I think this offensive line, a lot of veterans, can take some steps forward. And that's really all they need, Nick, is because they were dead last in pretty much everything last year, right? And they're going to marginally improve, at least by a couple of yards, a couple of more first downs, a couple more points per game. That's really all this team needs to compete at a high level, is just a little bit better offense, because they already do that, right? So I certainly think with this defense that they have, where they get back 8 starters after being tremendous, obviously guys like Yaya Black on the defensive line, Deontay Craig, he's going to be a very good player. I think Ethan Hurkett as well. Obviously Jay Higgins, picking him to be the defensive player of the year in this conference. The only guy they've added in the portal over the last couple of seasons, and Nick Jackson, was tremendous for them. So obviously they know what kind of player they have in Jackson from Virginia. Great linebacking core, great D-line. Sebastian Castro is an elite corner. Love what he provides for them. Xavier Nwankpa, a phenomenal X5 star at safety. And, of course, you picked Jamari Harris to be a big breakout player for them. And cornerback's the lone issue here with this defense. Harris, how will he play? Deshaun Lee, some limited depth behind with unproven players. But this is such a, well-coached cover 2 shell by Phil Parker. The defense is going to be elite, as always. I know it's a silly question, Nick, but can this, same old story provide a different result? And that includes winning this conference.
When you think about it, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. And that's exactly what we've seen with Iowa on offense for the past, 10, 15 years. It's the same story every year. They keep doing the same thing, expecting different results, and those results just do not come, because it's not going to happen with the way that this team is structured. This offense was horrendous last year when you look at where they rank in terms of national ranking: 132nd in points per game, 133rd in yards per game, 130th in pass yards per game, and 109th in rush yards per game. And even that number of 115.9 rushing yards per game, it's really not that impressive when you look at it. That's a pretty bad number considering how anemic this offense was passing the ball. They weren't even able to break 150 yards per game on the ground, outside the top 100 in yards per game on the ground as well. An atrociously bad number, 15.4 points per game, barely getting more than 2 touchdowns a game on offense. Just bad, bad, bad wherever you look at it. I think the defense will continue to carry this team. I think the defense is absolutely phenomenal, one of the nation's best. I like Jamari Harris. He had 42 total tackles last year and 8 pass breakups plus a pick. I like him to break out and be an absolute star this year and really improve those numbers, get the double-digit pass breakups, potentially get a few more picks and get that tackle number up a little bit more, focus, clean up the tackling a little bit. The offense is just atrocious. Yes, they're going to make a transition with a new offensive coordinator. About damn time they do so. They finally let the head coach's son go after just atrocious offense all over the place. The tight end play will carry this team on offense, if you can even say that at this point in time, because Iowa does produce incredible tight ends that are very physical. I think the quarterback, Cade McNamara, is better than any quarterback we've seen for this Iowa team in the past, several years. But is he going to be able to elevate this team at all? I'm not entirely sure. Seems like the same story, different year. Going to get the same results, though. Just disappointing again and again.
Yeah, good tight ends in Luke Lochley and Addison Ostenga. And the thing about Iowa is even though they're 129th in third down offense, they were 76th in plays. So every once in a while, they're able to stay on the field, and it allows them to either score or flip field, which eventually leads to scores. And the philosophy, I guess it's not bad, right? That's all you got to do is just do enough for your defense to perform. And I think that's going to be the story again that leads to them winning 10 games. I think the 2 losses we had for them was back-to-back at Minnesota and at Ohio State. There is a bye week in between there, so maybe they split those. But some opportunities there with a pretty easy schedule for them to probably finally get over that hump and be, in consideration to win this conference. As a USC fan, I withheld from a prediction, but Nick, you went with a, pretty interesting 9-3 mark against, they have, a loss to Notre Dame and a win over LSU in the season opener. And it really just comes down to what this defense can do. I think it's pretty interesting for you to say they will be able to perform this well in this new conference with this defense that they've had. It was just awful last year. They couldn't defend anything, especially against the run. They allowed, I think, over 48 points per game over the final 7 games of the year. They bring in Dalton Lynn, Eric Henderson. They really revamped, Matt Lance as well. They really revamped this coaching staff, brought in some elite names. In terms of transfers, they brought in some great guys in the secondary, and Greedy Vance, Kamari Ramsey, John Humphrey, Akil Arnold, his brother Easton Mascarenas Arnold at linebacker. And then Nate Clifton was the only guy they brought on the defensive line that seems incredibly thin. And this is a very hard schedule for USC. This is one where, last year, people try to say teams have soft schedules. Well, I use USC as an example. If you're not good, you'll lose to those opponents. And what do you know? They almost lost to every single opponent that was not very quality last year. This defense is going to have to do a complete 180, Nick, for them to win 9 games in their debut season. What makes you have so much confidence? Is it because of the staff that I think will perform very well, or you think the offense will finally have some complementary pieces on the other side to where they'll just get enough stops to win games?
Maybe I'm missing something. The books have this team at about 7 wins, 7.5 wins as their over-under, depending where you look, which is why I have them as my sleeper team, because I have them, exceeding the expectations by 2 wins and having them at 9-3. Maybe I am missing something. Maybe I'm a little blinded by the potential that this team has, blinded by the coaching with Lincoln Riley and bringing on Dalton Lynn, who I think is a fantastic defensive coordinator that could really change the culture that Alex Grinch built that was just absolutely horrendous. But I'm high on this team. I'm confident this team will be able to figure it out and get the job done. I think they will be able to beat LSU, catch them lacking week 1 in Las Vegas, and have a really solid season overall. I think Bear Alexander returning is a really good return. I know he didn't have the most incredible season last year, disappointed compared to the expectations when he transferred from Georgia, but still 48 total tackles, 6.5 tackles for loss, 1.5 sacks, 4 pass breakups. I'd like to see him get those numbers a lot higher this year. I think he can certainly do so. I think they added some really solid pieces out of the portal that you mentioned there. I think Nate Clifton's a really solid add that could break out and be a good player. Mason Cobb, a really good leader. Eric Gentry, I think he's a player that'll have a better season than he had in the past. Bryson Shaw, I think he'll have a decent season as well. I think the offense will be dynamite just like it was last year. I think the offense will be fantastic. No problems with the new quarterback they have plugged in there in Miller Moss. I think the defense will finally make that jump up and complement this team. They'll get stops when they need to. Yes, the schedule is tough, which is why I think 3 losses makes a lot of sense. You could definitely add a 4th loss in there if you look it over. But I like this USC team to get to 8-9 wins. I just have a feeling about them that makes sense to me. If we can look back at this at the end of the season, I may be wrong, but this is the gamble I'm going to take. I like the USC Trojans to overachieve in year 1 in the Big Ten.
Dalton Lynn did a great job at UCLA last year. They had some good talent there, but he really helped unlock, guys at all key levels, even though they were probably a little bit less talented and they performed to the level of. And of course, like you said, Miller Moss having a great bowl game. He's got a high level of talent at his disposal, including the wide receiver position. So 9-3 for LSU from Nick. and obviously Ohio State's going to win the conference. As we shift to the rest of the pack and the Big Ten, we'll slightly touch on each of these teams, but I think we're certainly going to highlight the ones at the top in Minnesota and Nebraska the most. Minnesota being my sleeper team in the conference. I think PJ Fleck, he's doing a pretty good job with the Golden Gophers, despite having an offense that's also along the along the Hawkeyes level, I would say, Nick, just with how stale they've been and how bad the quarterback position has been for Minnesota. Max Brosmer is going to come in from New Hampshire. This is a guy that was productive, showcased nice touchdown field, plays with confidence, has ball placement, has played a lot of football, has some nice IQ. I thought this was a pretty good receiving room heading in the last year, but obviously the deficiencies under center really plagued them. Daniel Jackson had a very good season. You picked him to break out even more this year, even though he already had 107 targets a season ago. Definitely wonder what production he can achieve this season. Elijah Spencer, I expect him to be better. Lameek Brockington's going to step into a full-time role. Tyler Williams was a good player, good recruit, that is, from Georgia. So they have a handful of different guys I think can produce in the receiving game. It's really up to this run game behind a really physical offensive line with nice talent and a deep backfield. They picked up Saya Bagheera from Ohio. He's got, almost 2,000 yards and 20 touchdowns over the last 2 years. Darius Taylor, he had 800 yards in 6 games. Absurd production for him. He quickly proved he could be a workhorse as well. I think this is a very good player. I think this is an incredibly deep backfield. It also picked up Marcus Major. Jordan Nubbin had 40 carries in a game for 200 yards and the lone start he had. So this is a very deep backfield. And again, I think this offensive line is really going to produce. Ariante Erzuri at left tackle showed he was a great run blocker for them. You look at some of the other guys. Greg Johnson's going to fill in for Nathan Bowe. They want him to be impactful, or they might really struggle in the interior. I think Quinn Carroll, he's going to be phenomenal as they move him to right guard. I think that's a better fit for him. Tyler Cooper at left guard was great. So they have some nice starting building blocks here. This offense, the Gopher fandom has a lot of excitement for him, Nick. I think that's certainly going to be why this team can overachieve this year. Well, on the other hand, the defense returns 9 starters from a unit that did disappoint. They finally, played to the level they probably should have been all along. Jod Joyner, Danny Striegel, some nice guys up front for them. And then I think the secondary, guys like Jack Henderson and Justin Whaley, Coy Pierce, a true freshman high-ranked safety is going to come in and hopefully make an impact. I think top to bottom, this is a good team. Now, that's a lot of information I just threw at you, Nick. But if this offense can play better, more physicality, more balance from the passing game, they can accomplish big things.
I think this is a very exciting team. Max Brosmer, a great add from New Hampshire, one of the highest rated quarterbacks that entered the portal this year. As soon as his name came in from the FCS level at UNH, he was a name that people wanted immediately. He ends up settling on Minnesota, which I like the fit. I think it makes a lot of sense. Daniel Jackson, in the slot, a really talented wide receiver. Yes, it's kind of weird picking a breakout player who had 800 yards last year and was the team's top receiver to be a bigger breakout player, but I think he can get to that 1,200 yards receiving mark and get to double-digit touchdowns after having 8 last year. I think he's going to be a name that you're going to know in the nation after this season. I don't think a lot of people know his name outside of hardcore college football followers as a top receiver, but I think you're going to know his name come the end of this season. He's going to get a lot of targets this year and be a really solid player with the increased production at quarterback. I think Elijah Spencer is also a solid player at the wide receiver X. I think the running back room's added some good players. Darius Taylor's just a sophomore who battled injuries last year but was really solid when he did play as a true freshman. I think the defense and the coaching for PJ Fleck are phenomenal with this team, and they'll be able to compete based off of that. I like this Minnesota team a lot. I think they're very exciting and fun to watch this year.
And of course, alongside them at 8 wins, Nebraska, a team that has not had a winning season since 2016, that is. It's just been any way you can lose a game, they've done it over the last couple of seasons, Nick. Literally every single way they found a way to do it. It's been quite embarrassing, and you even saw it last year as they continued to lose one-score games. But Matt Rule has a nice program. He's got, Tony White returning as defensive coordinator, a unit that was very good. I like when they get back in Ty Robinson and Nash Hutchmacher up front. I think this linebacking core led by Javen Wright is going to continue to improve. And in the secondary, they have good players, Tommy Hill, Isaac Gifford, some very solid players there. They also had some, true freshmen get on the field last year that are going to continue to, see more reps and I think provide more impact for them. But you really want to see this offense show up. Last year, the quarterback room was probably the worst in America. And how do you fix that? Well, you go out and land the top-ranked true freshman available, and Dylan Raiola. Obviously, family ties helped land that late ad. In the early national signing day period, the last day, they flipped him. So that was very impressive that they were able to accomplish that. I thought he should have been there all along. And Raiola going to have a nice supporting cast to work with. Jamal Banks from Wake Forest arrives. Malachi Coleman was a nice in-city recruitment they were able to keep home. Isaiah Neal, he might be able to provide something, but if not, I think Jalen Lloyd, 160-pound speedster, is going to be great. This offensive line, they really did some nice resurging as well. They're getting a good amount of veterans coming back, guys like Justin Evans, Ben Scott, Bryce Benhart in her sixth season. So I think there's some still upside to be attained on this offensive line. The offense overall has a good amount of talent. They do return 7 starters, but Raiola seems to be the missing piece, Nick. 18 points per game a year ago. Horrid passing attack to match a run game that was pretty solid. What do you think we're going to see from Nebraska this season that will elevate them to bowl eligibility finally?
This team is a fantastic team on paper that's continuing to try to round the corner under Matt Rule. They have one of the best fan bases in the nation that have been starved for a good team. Like I said, no winning record since 2016. They've gone through some tough times, a lot of close games. But now I think this is the year where they can finally get over that top and get a winning record with Dylan Raiola plugging in as the starting quarterback as a true freshman. Obviously, one of the nation's best quarterbacks, had a roller coaster of a commitment. Was playing high school football in California, moved to Georgia, seemed like Georgia had shored up his commitment. Didn't really want to sit around and wait behind that stacked logjam of a quarterback room they have out there in Athens. So on the last day, with some help from his family, like you mentioned, he flips to Nebraska and ends up becoming a potential star overnight and can start on day one for this team. He looked really good in the spring game. Yes, I know it's only a spring game, but he looked really solid in that game in his first appearance in Nebraska colors. Their quarterback play was absolutely horrendous last year, so I think this is an easy improvement. You plug him in immediately. He'll be able to get the job done early on. I think the running back room has some solid pieces. I think the wide receiving room has some good pieces with some solid ads in Banks and Neor, plus Malachi Coleman, who's a really solid player they're able to keep in state, plus some other players like Isaiah Garcia Casastanda, who's a really solid player, Jalen Lloyd in the slot. I like him as a younger player as well. This offense, I think, is very exciting. Matt Rule's an incredible coach who knows how to get results out of programs that have struggled for a very long time. Look at Temple, look at Baylor. Those are programs that were very bad for a very long time that he was able to get results out of, and now he comes to Nebraska, another poor program that has struggled for a very long time that I think he'll get results very quickly out of. I like this Nebraska team a lot. I like the coaching. I think the defense is pretty strong as well. Not a terrible schedule you're looking at either. A lot of positive things down there in Cornhusker country.
Now we'll quickly touch on the rest of the standings. It's kind of silly when you see all these 6-6 teams and teams struggle to make bowl eligibility. I think they're really going to beat up on each other this year, and that's kind of expected when you add so many new programs to the fold. I think with Wisconsin, this is a team that has Ches Malusi running the ball. Will Pauling really impressed as a pass catcher last year. I think this is a sound supporting cast. Guys like Joseph Griffin, C.J. Williams, the offensive line led by Jack Nelson. They should really take some shape this year, especially with Jake Renfro now, slotted into the starting lineup. The defense has 2 elite players in Ricardo Hallman at corner and of course, Hunter Wooler at safety. This team just doesn't seem primed for it yet. They bring in Tyler Van Dyke in the portal. A guy I'm just sick of watching play football. He just seems to cost Miami so often. You just can never find that good consistency level. I think this year for Wisconsin, of a tough schedule, they'll play good football. I just don't think you'll see it on the stat sheet, or in terms of wins, losses, that is. I don't think you'll see them bringing enough victories home this year. But I think Luke Fickell is going to build a program into a very sustainable winner over time. Maryland, kind of a quiet team here. I don't think this offense is really going to be able to accomplish much, mainly because of the deficiencies at quarterback. But with Kevin Sumlin, Josh Gaddis, Mike Loxley all in the building, there's enough cooks in the kitchen to get something done, especially when you have a running back like Roman Hemby and a wide receiving duo in Caden Prather and Ty Felton. I think the Maryland defense is an incredibly underrated unit as well, getting back veterans at all levels. Pretty deep at linebacker, nice defensive line, some nice veterans led by Dante Trader in the secondary as well. And of course, they added Jalen Husky in the portal. He's probably going to provide some good asset for them. Indiana, this is a team I think is pretty impressive in terms of what they have in their supporting cast. And, Mike Shanahan, Kurt Signetti, these guys have operated good offenses at JMU and at other destinations in the past. I think they have a deep backfield. I love the receiving room they have. Donovan McCulley was a very impressive player last year. Elijah Surratt was great for JMU. Miles Price is going to be a good asset in this receiving room. Keyshawn Williams as well. I mean, this is a nice wide receiver room. I think it's very underrated. This offense, I think, will play very well this season. I think they'll probably hit 30 points per game. There's a team in Indiana last year that was very competitive, ended up losing more games than they should have. I think their defense, though, at the end of the day, is going to be, having this team playing from behind a lot. Northwestern, they overachieved a season ago. Of course, Xander Mueller on that defense, probably going to be a player, again, that I picked to, make the first team. I think the defensive line for Northwestern is incredibly deep as well, led by guys like Richie Haggerty and Sean McLaughlin. But the offense for them really doesn't seem to be changing. Their offense loses the starting quarterback who had the position locked up, Nick, and he decides to just transfer out. And of course, I think A.J. Henning, Bryce Kurtz are solid receivers, but their offensive line was one of the nation's worst last year. And then Purdue, they obviously have a phenomenal safety in Dylan Thynum. Added a lot of, I think it was 4 players from Georgia in the transfer portal. Hudson Card's still a pretty respectable quarterback. Devin McGogby is a nice running back as well. Purdue, though, I just think this is going to be tough for them to win games this season because the defense still has to overcome some deficiencies, lose a lot of players. Kyron Jenkins, though, was also a beast for them. 4-8, though, for Purdue. Nick, what do you make of the left side of these standings where a lot of teams are having average or mediocre seasons, but I think in the case of like Maryland and Indiana, they'd be pretty happy.
I think Maryland and Indiana at 6-6 would be a bit disappointing. Indiana certainly would be a positive thing. They got the 6-6 under their first year head coach, who really has a long rebuild. They were struggling for a while. They were unable to compete with the top teams. Now they bring in Cignetti, who's a really solid coach that got a lot done at JMU at the FCS and FBS level, and now finds a big jump up to the Big Ten. Brings a lot of those players with him. So which is my only concern is how can those transfers transition to a tougher, more physical conference. Certainly worth keeping an eye on. Northwestern, they play a very interesting schedule. They're, not really playing a lot of home games, playing some games at Wrigley, playing at a couple different places, playing in a smaller stadium on campus. What will that look like this year? They overachieved last year after their coach got let go after a lot of weird, concerning allegations. They overachieved in year one of their new head coach, who had never been a head coach before and was really at the program not for a very long time. He jumped in and led the team to a solid year. The defense was really strong, but what will the offense look like for Northwestern? There's a lot of question marks there. I look at Wisconsin. They got a tough schedule. They got to play Alabama, a game that I will be attending up there in Madison. Look forward to seeing that campus, seeing that team in person. I think Luke Fickell's a fantastic coach who still has a lot of time to develop and build something, but I just don't think this is the time for Wisconsin right now. I think Van Dyke is just a player that you're not going to get a lot done with him. He's been a really weird player, had a very weird career, a lot of interceptions, very inaccurate, a lot of mistakes. Is he going to take this team to the next level? I really don't think so. The defense should still be really solid, and the running back room is good up there. But overall, I think 6-6 for Wisconsin. Maryland, they are in the post Talia Tagovailoa life. What will that quarterback room look like? What will the play look like? They have a really interesting ensemble of offensive coordinators and former head coaches running that offensive side of the ball. That staff is very interesting with guys with different pedigree and different legacies at different programs. Can Maryland figure it out on offense? I think the defense will still be solid. I think they'll get to a bowl game, but that's really about it. And then they look at Purdue. They're a team in transition. Can they upset somebody at home? They play some tough teams in West Lafayette where dreams are known to go to die and top teams have lost in the past. But I think a tough season, they kind of transition, continue to figure out what they want to do. I do think Hudson Card is a fun player and a player that can get this team and keep them in games. I think 4-8 is a little bit harsh on paper, but overall Purdue will be fun to watch if you can tune in and catch a game or two this year from the Boilermakers.
Notre Dame and Oregon come to West Lafayette. Look at the right side of the standings. Rutgers, a team that's also not really serious about improving on offense. Also, harder task for them, I would say. I certainly wonder what the loss of Gavin Wimsatt will do for them. Another guy who was penciled in as the starter at quarterback departs. This running game's really good last year. His legs were really helpful in doing so. Kyle Mongai still a beast of a nice offensive line, but Ethan Kalkamanis probably not going to be the answer at quarterback for them. The defense is still very sound, though. They get back 8 starters. That includes Aaron Lewis, Keontae Hamilton, of course, an elite linebacker, Mohamed Toure, a really nice secondary as well. Guys like, Robert Longerbeam have been tremendous for them. Desmond Igbeson will probably step up as well. So a nice defense for Rutgers. It's going to lead them to a bowl game this year. Washington, from national championship to losing their coach and every single starter. I think there's only 2 or 3 starters total coming back. That's all on the defensive side of the ball. Nobody's back on offense. They do a pretty good job in the portal, though. Will Rogers, Jonah Coleman, Jeremiah Hunter. Those are some nice transfers to add to this, air raid type of attack led by Jed Fish. The defensive side of the ball, though, they're destined to take a big step back. Cameron Fabio-Kun at safety is returning. Elijah Jackson as well. That's hopeful. They got some nice linebackers as well. Most of that room stays intact. But the pass rush just seems absolutely doomed. Or they weren't very good last year, and their best components are now gone. So I think Washington's going to take some major steps back this season. Jed Fish long-term will probably do a very sound job. Illinois, you certainly wonder what they would have accomplished last year if Luke Altmaier was not starting for majority of the year. John Paddock was tremendous. They're back to Altmaier, though, a guy who pretty much underwhelmed as much as you can. He certainly, has a pretty lackluster offense around him. I think the offensive line will be slightly improved. Wide receiver room, though, they lose some nice key components. Caden Fagan and Josh McCray. A nice physical running back duo. So I think if you can find some balance on this side of the ball, they'll be able to win some games. But Aaron Henry, I thought his defense would be much better last year. The run defense ended up settling down, but overall they still out almost 30 points per game. The defensive line loses Randolph and Johnny Newton, so that's certainly something to be worrisome about. They do have a great linebacking room led by Dylan Rozek. I think if these outside linebackers and Gabe Jackas and Seth Coleman can step up, then Illinois might have something cooking on this side of the ball. But I think they have a nice secondary as well, led by Miles and Xavier Scott. Picked up Terrence Brooks from Texas in the portal. So I certainly think you can see some nice improvements from Illinois this year on that side of the ball. I'm not going to pick them to make a bowl game just yet. Then Michigan State, obviously, Jonathan Smith arrives, bring Aiden Childs with them. Has a nice running back room in Nate Carter and K'Ron Lynch-Adams. Very weak wide receiver room. That's why I picked Nick Marsh to be a very impactful true freshman for them. Offensive line is a work in progress. The defensive side of the ball, and on paper, it's not bad. The defensive line has some guys, Naquan Dose, Maverick Hansen. Linebacking room is incredibly deep. They even added Jordan Turner and Wayne Matthews this year to compete with guys like Cal Halliday and Jordan Hall. The secondary, though, they were just a big problem under, Mel Tucker. They improved up to 87th in pass defense. I think they're going to take another step back, even with the add of Ed Woods at corner from Arizona State. Tough year for Michigan State at 4-8, and I think UCLA, they have a brutal schedule. I'm not really a fan of the coaching staff they have, even though they brought over Eric Bieniemy. That's just name value, Nick. I don't know how this game will translate to the college level. I think him and Deshaun Forrest will have some issues this year. Then we have one real game changer in J. Michael Sturdivant at wide receiver on offense. And now this defense that was elite last year returns only 4 starters. They do have some nice size on the interior defensive line still. Do return some starting linebackers as well. But there's a mass exodus in the secondary, even though they do return some nice players like Devin Kirkwood, Jalen Davies. I think overall this is a team that's just going to be a victim to a tough schedule. 4-8 for the Bruins. What do you make of, this side of the standings?
I'll start from the bottom and work my way up this time around. UCLA finishing tied for the bottom of the conference as they transition to the Big Ten. A tough welcome for them from the Pac-12. In my opinion, the weakest of the teams that the Big Ten added from the Pac-12. I really just don't think they add a whole lot to the conference in terms of value, in terms of football value, and really don't add a whole lot of value outside of that, in my opinion. They're the weakest add of the teams. Kind of just feels like a package deal with USC for the city of LA. It doesn't really work long term. I think they're going to continuously be a bottom feeder in the conference. A tough transition. Eric Bieniemy at offensive coordinator, is that even going to really work? Yes, he's got good pedigree. Was a guy that was thrown around as a head coach since the NFL, just never got that opportunity. Didn't really look great with the Commanders. Has struggled since he left Kansas City. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I do think Michael Sturdivant at wide receiver is a guy you want to watch. If you're going to tune in and watch UCLA games, keep your eye on him. He's a really incredibly talented wide receiver, one of the nation's best, a really solid player that's going to continue to develop into a star. Michigan State, the Mel Tucker era is basically over. Before it really got back to its feet, they had a really great season with him at one point, but then, weird scandals, and he finds himself out of a job. Jonathan Smith leaves his alma mater of Oregon State, a job that he really could have had for life, to come over to a tough rebuild out there in East Lansing. He brings his quarterback, Aiden Childs, with him, who I think is an incredible player who can really develop into a star. I really liked what I've seen out of him in limited opportunities last year. The defense, I think, is going to struggle for Michigan State. I think there's a lot of question marks on that side of the ball, but I think the offense will improve over time. And Michigan State, I think they will be contending in 2-3 years. It's just going to be a little bit of a rebuild out there. Certainly a tough spot right now, but I do think they have the chance to be successful in terms of all the teams with new coaches across college football at this moment in time. Illinois, Luke Altmaier, not a very good quarterback in my opinion. They're going to struggle this year and really hold this team back. The defense loses really solid players, but I do think the defense still has some solid pieces. Brett Bielema, I don't really know if this is going to get much better for him. I think this is a team that's just going to continue to be average at best. That's sort of, they met their ceiling out there in Champaign. I think they're just going to kind of be just this average at best team, 5-7, 6-6, 7-5. That's where this team is doomed to go, in my opinion, with where they are. I think the offense will struggle. I do like the running back room, has some talented pieces. Washington, what a fall for grace, but that kind of happens when you lose your head coach and your entire offense and most of your defense. No returning starters on offense is a really incredible thing to think about. Will Rogers, that's a good add. He's a really solid quarterback, really great in the pocket, an incredible air raid player, gonna air the ball out a whole lot. I think he'll fit much better than he did in the new scheme that was being run in Starkville following Mike Leach's tragic passing that had occurred in the past. I think Rodgers will be an incredible quarterback. The offense outside of that, though, completely new look, a lot of different transfers you're plugging in, and then obviously you lose your head coach to Alabama. No shame in that. When the tide come calling, it's hard to say no. They plug in Jed Fish from Arizona, that is, who I think is a really incredible coach who was building a lot of great things down there in Tucson, Arizona, had a really solid season. Now he heads up to the Northwest, but still has those recruiting Rising Tides from the West Coast can still be able to bring in some talented players, has a bit more resources up there in Seattle. I do like Washington to be solid in the future, but a tough year, and those fans are not going to really enjoy being that. But it doesn't really matter when you take that fun ride and go to a national title game the year before. Then finally, Rutgers, a team that I do personally care about, a team that I've rooted for most of my life. I think they are heading in the right direction under Greg Schiano. The offense is continuing to be an issue. I think Kyle Monagai, if he wasn't there, this team would be in deep trouble. We'll be looking at a 3-4 win season. He returns. He's a really incredible back with really nice speed, nice footwork, good vision to find the open hole. I like the offensive line to be solid this year. They're continuing to build in the trenches. I think, Greg Schiano's second stint is going really well. The team won a bowl game last year, beat Miami in the Pinstripe Bowl. I think they'll get back to a bowl game this year. I had them at 7-5, even 6-6. Very close there. I think they will get back to a bowl game, which is really all you really want down there in Piscataway is get to a bowl game, try to find a way to win a bowl game. That's a very strong season for the Scarlet Knights. They're no longer the laughingstock of the Big Ten. They're a team that can compete with some of the other teams in this conference and find themselves in bowl eligibility consistently, in my opinion. And that's really all you can ask for. A solid season at 6-6 or 7-5, in my opinion, for Rutgers.
That's me for today's episode. As always, Nick, appreciate you joining me. Make sure you guys like, comment, subscribe. See you next time.